I am Bruce Grant from Anthropology at NYU. I'm really delighted to welcome our speaker for this afternoon. Angela Brintlinger has come to us from Ohio State University, where she is a not just professor and graduate chair in Slavic and Eastern European languages and cultures, but also the director of their Center for Slavic and East European Studies. She got her BA in English and Russian Lit from Rice University in Houston, Texas, not too many years ago. It felt just like yesterday, and where I had the glad chance to meet this rather astonishingly capable Russian speaker at very early on in her career. She went on. I got to follow in her footsteps for a while for her first MA in Russian language at Middlebury College, and then she followed with a second and a PhD in Slavic literature from Wisconsin-Madison. Angela is well known to many in our field through two excellent books. Her first monograph in 2008 covered writing the useful past, did a wonderful job of talking about Russian literary culture in the first 2 decades of the Soviet Union. She followed up just a handful of years later, just in a very short time, with Chapayev and his comrades about the trajectory of this famous socialist character, hero. But actually what is bringing her here today is a different side of some of the academic work that we all do, but that some people do more than others and better than others, which is not just a series of edited works, but really superb translations. I won't mention all of the edited volumes, which are numerous, or the translations, a particularly well-known one on Vyazemsky, but I, in particular, got excited about drawing Angela here last year because, like some people in the room, I didn't bring it with me today, got my copy of Russian Cuisine in Exile, the long kind of cult hit by, of course, the fantastic Pyotr Vyazemsky and Alexander Genius. And I was startled by the book, and I haven't had a chance to say this to Angela in person, but because I was ready for the usual treatment, which would be, I mean, the book is an easy book to love. It's smart and funny, and you want a good translation to deliver it in that fashion. But it became much more than that. It wasn't the standard kind of tossing off of a fine introduction and then a good set of some careful footnotes and so forth. If the original text was already incredibly smart and funny and important because it covered kind of this world historical event of this expulsion and expression and pushing out of all of some of the Soviet Union's best around the world, I would say Angela and her co-producer really added to it by adding these really, at times, kind of like, I kept reading and thinking, were they allowed to do that? These encyclopedic notes that they added, not just as one would hope, in the best way for social context and so forth, but incredibly granular attention to the language, so that one gets an immediate sense of just the pleasure in the delivery of this work of art itself. And really, I would say, kind of creating, by my experience of it, really creating a kind of a parallel texting conversation with it. It was, to me, one of the best examples of what this kind of project should be. And I knew that it was going to be followed by more, and at least a new edited volume, Seasoned Socialism. So food is on the table for today. The title of Angela's talk you see up on the board behind me, Kvas Patriotism in Russia, Cultural Problems and Cultural Myths. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you for that. Oh my goodness, what a lovely introduction. I originally, I had this couple of books coming out, and I thought, I should go and do some talks. Wouldn't that be fun? And then, of course, I thought of a different topic for my talk today. So you'll see how it's connected to some of what I've been doing. Now, I'm going to try some tricks that I haven't done before. I'm going to pop back and forth into video clips. And I'm going to use a film that you saw on the poster that is a kind of almost prototypical Soviet film in that it is lovely, it is multifaceted, and it doesn't unfold rapidly. So be prepared for some longish clips, because in order to get the points, you have to kind of watch a little bit. So I'm hoping it's going to work. We'll see how it goes. Again, thank you for that kind introduction. That was so sweet. I would say that Well, I can start by saying that this interest in food comes from my own personal life of both feeding and being fed, both feeding my family here and being fed by my friends in Russia, learning to cook really in a Soviet dorm room back in the 80s. When there wasn't a lot of food actually in the stores, and I learned that one shouldn't buy mayonnaise just because I grew up in the 70s eating mayonnaise in suburban Chicago. You really don't. My Soviet roommate said, "No, никто не ест mayonnaise. Советская mayonnaise не едят." So it was an interesting experience. Anyway, as Bruce mentioned, my colleague Tom Ferrick and I translated this Russian cuisine in exile. We had a really good time doing it, and we were really fortunate to do it with Academic Studies Press because they produced it in this beautiful way where the footnotes are on the side. We were really worried. How do you do footnotes? This text can't be perceived unless you understand all of the deep underpinnings, but you know how it is when you're reading and your eye goes down to the bottom of the page all the time and it really distracts you, and you don't want to be distracted from a really good text. So I was excited with how they laid it out because we have these kind of decorative footnotes in red on the side. So you can read them or you can not read them, you can go back, you can play with them. And it really did turn into a kind of a conversation among the four of us, we felt, as we worked on this book. As I said, I've been teaching and exploring issues of food in Russian literature, film, and culture. We did that book, which came out this way in this really beautiful edition. And then with another couple of colleagues, I co-edited this Seasoned Socialism. I'd be happy to pass it around if anybody hasn't seen it later. In my article for Seasoned Socialism, I looked at specific food. I chose to look at the food, at cabbage. I looked at cabbage in a couple of different ways, in a couple of different authors. And one of the things that I came to understand and to argue is that we can look at these foods, these specific foods, and their use and representation in Russian life and art to gain that deeper understanding that we're all looking for of Russian cultural problems and myths. I drew a little bit on Terry Eagleton, who has written that food looks like an object, but is actually a relationship. I think that's a kind of a deepening way to think about it. And in Seasoned Socialism, I continue this line of thinking to argue that cabbage is actually a multivalent and even gendered symbol of nourishment, national pride, folk wisdom, and family. Today, in thinking about Russian cultural myths, I will highlight three issues. First, that Russian ideas about food and drink become heightened during times of war and conflict. I love this old poster from World War II. I'll let you look at it. Second, that specific Russian food items retain meaning beyond their basic ability to sustain life and gain importance as symbols of national pride. And third, that these food items, more often than not, point back to Russia's identity as a peasant nation. I think it will become clear from my examples that the relationship between food and country almost always intensifies in times of national anxiety. As we examine some specific examples, the myths we should keep in mind are those of a golden age of tradition and simplicity in Russia, of some true Russia embodied in an anti-urban peasant utopia. In most cases, the myth acknowledges that peasant life and Russian life generally has never been easy, but that ideal or utopia remains nonetheless. Before we even get to Kvas Patriotism, I want to note the ways that patriotism itself can be harnessed by politicians and poets, by writers and philosophers, often to highlight a certain kind of nostalgia, couched as a romance with the past, a history seen as heritage. Of course, all those words are quite charged, as we can talk about later. Okay, so we're going to start with a short video clip, which will need a little context. Last year, Georgian-born Soviet filmmaker Marlen Vutsev died at the age of 93. Called in his obituaries a key figure of 1960s Soviet cinematography and a generally acknowledged classic, Vutsev achieved early success with several Thaw films, but then fell afoul of censors with his 1961 film, Ilyich's Gate, Zastava Ilyicha. As film historian Josephine Wall put it, Vutsev deliberately enhanced the topicality of this film at every turn, casting students from his alma mater, the Geek Film School, as well as African students in Moscow, poets like A.R.J. Vyazemsky, and filming at construction sites around the city. In some ways, this is a film about building and construction and sort of the layers of time and history and how everything kind of builds on top of what's already there. So by March 1963, Nikita Khrushchev had singled out the filmmaker as portraying in Ilych's Gate, quote, ideas and norms of public and private life that are entirely unacceptable and alien to Soviet people. So released 4 years later as I Am 20, the film had significantly less impact on Soviet viewers in its delayed, compromised, and truncated state. But in my view, I Am 20 is still a great film. And when I showed it to my Russian food and cuisine students last semester, it brought up for me many of the usual Russian problems. Fathers and sons, who is to blame, what is to be done. The plot follows three friends as they try to figure out their paths in life. Should they study, find their way in the workplace, marry and have children? The main character, Sergei, is also tormented by memories of his father, who perished during World War II when he was still a small boy. How should this new generation live in the wake of such sacrifice? What are their responsibilities toward the past and toward the future? How should they organize their daily lives and relationships in order to enjoy themselves and yet keep a purpose in mind? This is a great scene, which we're not going to watch, in which they call out to their friend who brings down a pot of something. They're all hungry, so they call up to their friend who brings it down to the playground, and they all hang out. And his married friend is tortured by family life, which is always difficult when the children are small, as some of you may remember. Okay, so the scene I want to show you features at a party at the apartment of Sergei's girlfriend's parents. Everyone, oh, this is not a good image. Everyone at the party is young and carefree, and Sergei's gloomy and serious attitude is out of place. So let's see if this is going to work. Yes, exactly. I'm going to stress exactly. So Vera confronts him. You can see also. You can see there's the Hakhlama, so you've got this kind of intellectual apartment with kind of Russian artifacts of one kind and another. So we'll get to the moment when, again, a little bit slow. They can't quite figure out, she can't figure out what's up with him, what's his mood all about, what's going on.
О чем ты сейчас думал? Ты знаешь, у меня такое чувство, как будто сегодня должно что-то.
Что?
Да нет, ничего. Странно ты все-таки, Парень. Я никогда не знаю, о чем ты думаешь, когда ты вот так молчишь.
Эй, вы, ну придумайте что-нибудь!
Давайте выпьем. А я не пью. Мне и так хорошо.
So the music picking up. We've got a friend who shows up with potatoes.
Юра? Юра? Коля, ну только тебя здесь не хватает. Метрополь. Блюдо по спецзаказу, картошка а-ля Нет, не могу. Еще 3 обязательных визита, даже работать. А ты не работаешь. Поздравляю вас. Поздравляете?
Картошку на
So we've got the French music. The camera work a little bit. We're just going to skip ahead a little bit. They're enjoying themselves. They're fooling around. We're going to jump ahead a little bit here. We're going to skip this young woman, although we'll mention her again. Jump ahead to. Sergei goes off to get a phone call. He comes back, and everybody's really enjoying themselves. I love the juxtaposition of the types of people. This sort of золотая молодежь here.
Практичная одежда для болот, вернисажей, гуляний загородных, гуляний, прогулок, игры в городки, служебных командировок. Современная линия начинается у горла и завершается простыми схватками в районе позвоночника. Расход ткани 3 метра, при ширине метра 45.
Я как-то думал, про кассе моделей довольно похоже.
Я манекен.
Могу я узнать ваш телефон?
Я замуж.
Я же не руки у вас прошу. Как вы все начинаете?
На храмовый храм.
Okay, here we go. Taking off her shoes. Don't forget about the potatoes, though. Here they are. Doesn't quite compute because they were eating them, right? How could they be in the necklace now?
And on the floor.
Watch this. Exactly. So the mood is going to shift. And Sergei is upset. He's going to get aggressive. He was already moody. We already knew that.
Тише, тише. Сейчас я вам сделаю сюрприз. Что-то вроде лаптей и картошки.
Fast shoes, potatoes. What comes next?
Давай, давай.
So it's really beautiful. You can listen to it later.
Ну вот, теперь у нас полный комплект. Лапти, картошка, старинная обрядовая песня. Хватает только сыка на медведя.
Move it ahead a little bit. And here's Sergei. What's he going to do?
Ну, хватит. Давайте я выпьем, а? За что? За картошку. Ну-то, может быть, лучше за рыбу? А я хочу выпить за картошку. А может быть, стоит этот тост произнести в стихах? Ой, она, конечно, не картошка. За картошку. Называется тост под барабан.
All right. So pause for a moment. Let's consider the potato. As some of you may remember, in her research about post-Soviet Russian society, Nancy Reese defines the potato as a cognitive resource. She explains that it functions for post-Soviet Russians as an object in the world coupled to the social mind, and thus an irreducible vehicle of thought about and action in the world. Further, she argues that potato discourse legitimizes and celebrates the population's ability to feed itself autonomously, no matter what. I built on her argument a little bit in trying to create some sort of a cabbage discourse in my article. I Am 20, though, makes a similar argument, that potatoes saved lives during World War II, including the life of our main protagonist and his mother. Sergei has very intimate reasons for his patriotism, and Hutsev has already threaded some of those through the scene. I skipped the part where he's called to the phone, but one of his buddies is concerned about the other one. He and this threesome of 3 boys are creating this kind of три товарища situation, these kind of comrades going together through life and kind of looking after each other. At another point that I skipped, Sergei notices a young woman who's really pensive. He doesn't know her, and he asks her a little bit about her. He says, "Oh, where are you from? Where are your parents?" And she said, "Они под Смоленском. My parents are near Smolensk." In other words, they died during the war. So she too is a war orphan. So these ties that we see between certain people threading through the scene, both visible and invisible, bind the members of this generation, a generation, as Sergei is going to emphasize, that is fatherless. However, there are other young people at the party who are bored with such serious concerns. For them, potatoes and bast shoes and folk songs all fit into one category. Old Russia. All we need now is gypsies and bears, the party guest complains. So let's see what happens to Sergei and his toast here.
Оратор пробивает кулаком трибуну.
Я что-то не понимаю, что ты хотел этим сказать?
А я понимаю. Догадываюсь. Что ты понимаешь? Опуская все детали, подробности, разъяснения, уверения, заклинания, я назову все твои разнообразные мысли по поводу картошки так. Квасной патриотизм.
Как?
Квасной, от слова квас. К этому нельзя относиться серьезно.
К этому можно. А к чему можно относиться серьезно? О чем вообще можно говорить всерьез?
Знаешь что, ты только не бери на себя роль гражданской совести.
Слушай, не валяй дурака. Я тоже так умею говорить. Все мы это умеем. Ну а что дальше?
А у тебя есть вещи, о которых ты можешь говорить серьезно? Нет, ты можешь мне хоть чем-нибудь ответить?
Но если нет вещей, о которых можно говорить всерьез, тогда вообще, наверное, их не стоит жить. Или ты не согласен?
Это уже провокационный вопрос. Я могу его тебе задать.
А я отвечу. Я серьезно отношусь к революции. Песня «Интернационал». 1937 году. В войне. Солдат. Потому что почти у всех, вот у нас нет отцов. Их картошки, которые не спасались в голодное время, и которые,
А как вы
кстати,
относитесь
тоже.
к крепи?
Что?
К крепи как вы относитесь? Вы мне так и не ответили.
All right. So this young woman here is the one whose parents died. You're smiling. Okay. So let's get back here for a second. We will leave this for a minute. We'll come back to it. Place. See if we can keep going. Right. So Kvas Patriotism. So this kind of highlighting moment, and again, two different types of people at this party, two different kind of groups that Hutsev is trying to portray. And Sergei is the serious one. He's the one who is the thoughtful one who kind of goes through the entire film, and we follow him and see how he tries to solve his life problems, how he tries to figure out what he should do in the face of this new life, dancing, fun times, and yet all the serious stuff is still very strong for him. So Kvas, like potatoes and bast shoes, harkens back to a peasant past, some kind of true Russia from olden times. Here, the argument emerges in the juxtaposition of at least two worlds. First, the party, with its music, games, light atmosphere of living in the contemporary world, jazz, fashion shows, dancing, and flirting. And second, the Russia of the countryside. Modern pumps are thrown aside in favor of bast shoes. The dance music gives way to Russian folk song. The first action is a lighthearted joke, but the mournful music destroys the mood of the party. Look at this bickering back and forth. The term Kvas patriotism, especially as used here, implies an insult. But for me, this confrontation illustrates the complex social atmosphere of the early 1960s Russian life. Young people need to explore, play games, enjoy their lives, sort out their relationships with each other, the past, and the future. But Hutsev shows us that contemporary Moscow is filled with orphans, young people left bereft in the wake of World War II. No matter the desire to rebuild a new city and nation, all those construction sites that he shows us, the demolished past remains as an ever-present layer in the Russian psyche. And that past has a tendency to return, to surface unexpectedly, and to interfere with everyday tasks. So let's see if this actually works. I want to look at a slightly earlier scene this is still the second part of the film, before moving further back to explore the history of Kvas patriotism. Let's see if this is going to actually hit where I want it to. Nope.
Солдат.
Okay, we gotta go back.
Потому что почти.
No problem. I know there are people who are more sophisticated than I am who can do better with this. But. Right, so here we are in Sergei's apartment with his mother and his sister.
Да.
Я думаю, если ты мне сказал, то из этого уже не делается секрет.
Нет, это не твое дело.
Ну, конечно, не мое, не твое, ты молчишь.
Вот о чем.
We're trying to sort things out.
Когда? Нет, лишних. Вопросы
It's a little bit like my office.
Ну хорошо, вот аналитическая геометрия, 1936 год издания. Может быть, это можно выбрать?
Мне бы не хотелось, это папины книги.
Простяга, я речаю. Помочь. Ой, смотрите, что это? Какие документы? Документы. Мам, по-моему, это...
Что? Где вы их нашли?
Здесь. Не здесь, что?
Где, вот здесь? Господи, каким же образом?
На октябрь месяц 41-го года. Ты ж почти археологическая находка, об этом можно в вечерку сообщить. Рабочие.
Рабочие. А это моя. Нам будет теперь рабочие.
А детская это моя?
So all the time, watch Sergei in the background getting dressed for the party.
Здесь возвращения.
Теперь легкая. Как могла их сюда сунуть?
Смотрите, ребята. Это же полные 2 декады. Сколько хлеба.
Давайте справим 20-летний юбилей на уважаемые карточки.
Ничего смешного нет.
Again, this is a similar instinct, right? To celebrate, to make light of it.
И как же вы тогда прожили?
Так. На картошке. Ночью мне надо было идти в госпиталь на дежурство, а днем я поехала за город нарыть картошки. Меня тогда солдаты подвезли. Это подсходит. Меня порвало, ехать в душку. Помню, что никакого страха у меня тогда не было, кроме того, что мы с Сережкой карточки потеряли. Тоже потом я напугалась вдоволь. Солдаты куда-то ушли. Вечер.
The next one. This
Я
one.
копаю картошку, холод страшный, грязь. Реву при этом не переставая. Потом обратно пошла. Иду и не знаю, где немцы. Может быть, они уже впереди меня. А мешок тяжелый, мокрый. И бросить его нельзя никак. Дома же Сережка сидит голодный. Не кормить его совершенно. Никаких запасов. Пришла в Москву. Москва темная. На улицах пусто, холодно. Патруль ходит. Переулок наш перегорожен мешками с песком. И одни только эти разводки торчат. Я Сережку накормила и бегом-бегом в госпиталь. А ночью без меня приходил отец. Прям с передовой на 2 часа. Он даже не стал тебя будить. Поцеловал и ушел.
А меня?
А тебя тогда еще не было.
Почему?
Нет.
Okay, so we find out in a minute that,
Еще раз я видела отца.
yeah, one more time.
Зимой 43-й. Он после госпиталя месяц жил дома.
So anyway, one of the things that's fun to watch then is we see here the little boy that you see is actually a neighbor
Я пошел.
in this kind of apartment.
Ну, я тоже пошел. До свидания. Спасибо за помощь.
All right. So the imagery, you know, again, it's a little slow. That's how it works. But the imagery is really very deliberate, and of course the карточки на хлеб, right? This is this very you know, both a physical memory that she can touch, something that she's takes her back, and the children are listening. The children are paying attention and thinking about, you know, what this all meant. From here, Sergei goes on to the party and realizes that people are going to be playing with potatoes, which they really should not be doing. Right, so let's just stop this for a second. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so this is the background. For Sergei's dark mood, we notice not just the evocation of the past in the books, published in 1936, surely we could throw that one away, and the misplaced ration cart, but also the father's portrait, as I pointed out, in his uniform in place of pride on the wall. Sergei is thinking of moving in with his girlfriend, if they can find a room, but his own family's room in the communal apartment is filled with not just books, but ghosts. We look at the space and we see a rather favorable representation, I would say, of the Russian family and social life. The mother is a medical worker, educated, loving, serious, living with her 2 almost adult children in 2 rooms of this communal apartment, good relations with the neighbors, the little boy from next door is practically a member of the family. Sergei's mother remains true to her husband's memory, and Sergei and his sister quarrel, but they're very close friends. We can see this little family, again, so we have kind of these 3, we have the 3 boys, there's a little parallelism there, survived the terrors of the war, including the invading German army, the dark and cold, the hunger of daily life, which portrays them as self-sufficient Russian or indeed Soviet patriots. The accusation of plugging Sergei at the party does not stick. He is no false patriot. But if World War II, as we know, is referred to in Russian as the Великая Отечественная война, Great Patriotic War, in which the enemy was Nazi Germany and its allies, we need to return to the original Отечественная война, the war against Napoleon and the French, to find the origins of the term Kvas Patriotism. It's only appropriate that nationalism and cuisine be associated with the French, since upper-class cuisine from the late 18th century on was influenced by French chefs and culinary authors. And the peasant fare of Russia was downgraded. Sort of a fabulous quote from a Moscow doctor about Russian cuisine. If philosopher Pyotr Vyazemsky stated about his countrymen that we Russians come to the world without patrimony, many of his contemporaries and near contemporaries, starting with Gavril Derzhavin and Alexander Pushkin, would have disagreed. In the Romantic 19th century, Svetlana Boym has argued there were 2 carriers of the national dream, writers and peasants. And I'm hoping in the examples I'm going to show you, we'll see the connections between those. So let's look at the origins first of the term Kvas Patriotism. In an 1827 letter from Paris, Russian poet Pyotr Vyazemsky wrote, "Many see patriotism as unqualified praise of everything that is your own." French economist A.R.J. Turgot called this servant patriotism, du patriotisme d'antechamber. In our country, we could call it Kvas patriotism. Here, Vyazemsky, a veteran of the War of 1812 and even the Battle of Borodino, imports a French term that coincides with a platform of cultural self-sufficiency and an idea of Russian national identity, which in some periods of history have been seen as positive traits. Patriotism, and with it nationalism, are on the rise again in Russia and indeed across the world. But what does it mean to praise everything that is your own over things, ideas, and influences from abroad? And what might it mean in Russia in particular, where the old binary of East and West still lingers over national identity? It's interesting, in fact, that Vyazemsky was writing from France about a French idea and importing or translating it into Russian. For Turgot, this patriotisme d'antichambre was a class thing. Servants, he argued, hold closely a narrow understanding of their own culture, praising it above all others, potentially with no knowledge of any foreign culture at all. In a funny way, I would say that we saw a version of this. Oh, hang on a second. I missed my last slide, sorry. In the new Downton Abbey film, The Revolution from Below Stairs, where the action centers around the visit of the King and Queen of England to the estate house. I hope some of you have seen it. Fantastic film, beautiful costumes. In a surge of patriotism and loyalty to their own, to the traditions of Downton Abbey, the kitchen staff plot to oust the royal family's French chef and to deliver their own beloved dishes to their sovereigns at table instead. But Turgot wasn't even talking about food. It was Vyazemsky who moves the idea from the antechamber into the dining room, or into the peasant hut maybe, by invoking Kvas. This is where I want to have the slide. There we go. Vyazemsky's translation also invokes class, but here to suggest that any person, read peasant, who drinks Kvas to quench his or her thirst is not thinking about patriotism. And anyone being deliberately patriotic by serving Kvas is not offering it authentically, but moving the drink from the peasant home to the aristocratic dining room. Let's keep this definition, false or jingoistic, patriotic feelings in mind. as we look at some earlier examples that predate Vyazemsky's translation. Before Vyazemsky, Russian poets and patriots were already praising the simple Russian life. As early as 1795, in his poem Invitation to Dinner, Gavril Derzhavin heralded the Russian values of hospitality, simplicity, and moderation. I'm going to quote just in English here. Come eat and drink your fill, make merry, he invites his guests. Good health and peace hold benefaction. In moderation dwells the feast. His fare is simple, not sweets confected for the Tsar in golden banquet halls, but rich it is in taste and neatness, provided by my lady's sweetness. So, friends and family, openness and hospitality. These are the values that Derzhavin espouses. The ode features Horatian themes, the transience of existence, as well as the importance of friendship and of temperate enjoyment of life's pleasures. The imitation of Horace, of course, moves the poem out of the purely Russian, but even though it is set in St. Petersburg, the dinner is homely, the very opposite of fancy or French. Let me see. Yeah, okay. Some years later, in his long verse epistle to Eugene, Life at Zvanka, penned at the request of Yevgeny Poltovitinov, Derzhavin praises his country estate. The quiet and isolation of this and really any country idyll, with the bounty of its forests and its calm beauty, are complemented by his gorgeous table. These foods that he celebrates in this epistle are truly local: berries and mushrooms from the forest, fish from the river, baked goods from his estate's ovens. And the entirety is described, many of you probably remember these quotes, as a patterned garden, colorful and healthful. Бьет полдня час, рабы служить к столу бегут. Идет за трапезу гостей хозяйка с хором. Я озреваю стол и вижу разных блюд, цветных поставленных узором. Багряна ветчина, зеленый шиф желтком, румяно-желт пирог, сыр белый, рахи красный, что смоль, янтарь, икра, и с голубым пером, там щука пестрая. Прекрасно. Прекрасно потому, что взор мой манит вкус, но не обилием и чуждых стран приправой, что опрятно все представляет Рус. Припас домашний, свежий, здравый. Right? So, no spices from foreign harbors, wholesome Russian fare. His feast is a visual one. It delights the eye with its many colors. His splendor, though, is as much about its origins as the various preparations. This feast features not French champagne and truffles, but meat, soup, pie, cheese, caviar, and river fish, plus Russian wines from the Don and Crimea, and other drinks, including sparkling birch beer. Derzhavin and his guests raise a glass of sparkling birch beer to the Tsar and his family. And if that's not clear enough, the poet later quotes his guests as saying, "We would rather die for our faith and our Tsar than be citizens of France. За веру за царя мы, говорят, помрем, чем у французов быть в подданстве." Notice the year. This is 2019. We'll get to that. This, of course, is all happening on the cusp of the First Patriotic War. As Napoleon is consolidating his power and looking to expand his empire, Derzhavin's patriotism is awakened. His love of fine foods, his hospitality, and joy in entertaining are made more fulfilling by the thumb he sticks in the eye of the French. Russia is the source of river fish and crabs. Russia's country estates are filled with birch trees, ready to be turned into beer. And Russia's empire reaches to the Don and the Crimea, thus permitting comfortable substitutions and the feasibility of celebrating one's own produce and products, indeed of being isolationist. Here in my slides, I make some pretty clear comparisons, jumping centuries, really, to demonstrate a kind of Russian culinary continuity. Because while we saw some isolationism in the Stalinist era, represented here by this Konchalovsky still life, and the famous banquet end papers from the Stalin era book of tasty and healthy food, or what Vyazemsky called socialist photorealism of the food products celebrated inside that cookbook. Beautiful images We see even more pride in self-sufficiency today, as Russians scramble to deal with the results of the renewed Cold War, those hated sanctions which have forced Russians to celebrate their own food production yet again. Forced and perhaps enabled them to turn inwards. Derzhavin was obviously influenced in his writing by ancient poetic genres, by Horatian odes and country idyls, but in turn he was pulling his details from life on late 18th and early 19th century Russian estates. These estates, whether urban or rural, valued above all self-sufficiency and hospitality, two traits which we still see in current Russian life. As these images from my summer Russian expedition to a dacha community west of St. Petersburg show, the landscapes and the larders have not changed all that much since Derzhavin's time. So this research is still at a fairly preliminary stage. My analysis of the current media landscape for any shift of meaning in the use of Kvas Patriotism will have to wait for another talk, or indeed for the article that I'm working on. But I want to focus on two more texts from the work of Alexander Pushkin to see how Kvas fits into the Russian world that he portrays. So again, we think sometimes of Pushkin as Derzhavin's heir. He built himself that way, and he certainly has also interest in the use of Kvas. He brings up Kvas in his work, and not only Kvas, of course. So I want to look at these two works in reverse chronological order. Pushkin published his novel, The Captain's Daughter, in 1836. So he may very well have known Vyazemsky's term, although, again, I need to look a little harder to see how it spread. It was from a private letter. It did get into, I think I saw it in Dod, so it does start to spread, but it's not anywhere in Pushkin's collected works. So he didn't use it in letters or anywhere else. If you remember, The Captain's Daughter is a historical novel set in the 1770s. So in language and mores, the characters bring the 18th century to life. And again, though the war being portrayed is actually an internal one, the Turgot Rebellion, anti-French sentiment is running high. Many, many years ago, when I was doing my first work on my dissertation, I worked with David Bethay, and we were making this argument, really, that Petrusha Grinyov, Pyotr Andreevich Grinyov, the main character of The Captain's Daughter, is based in part on Derzhavin, who had some of these very same experiences that Grinyov had, and told about them in his autobiography. Okay, so the young protagonist, Pyotr Andreevich Grinyov, who's also the narrator, describes the sad scene of his first morning after, when Grinyov is treated to a haranguing by his disapproving servant Savelich, who draws a very clear distinction between what is Russian and what is foreign, and he uses categories of drink to do so. Grinyov, the narrator, recollects. My thoughts were interrupted by Savelich, who had entered with a cup of tea. Shaking his head, he said to me, "Too soon, Pyotr Andreevich, too soon have you gone down this road. And whom are you taking after? Neither your father nor your grandfather was a drunk, and your mother has never touched a drop of anything stronger than Kvas." Savelich is a stern and at the same time garrulous old man, and thus the chastising continues. It turns out, lo and behold, the French are at fault. Who is to blame? That accursed monsieur. He was always running in to see Antipyevna to say, "Madame, je vous prie, some vodka." That's where je vous prie gets you. What can I say? He sure taught you well, son of a bitch. Why on earth did they hire a foreigner, a Basurmanian, to teach you, as if the Barin didn't have enough of his own people? Savelich goes on to give his master some excellent folk advice. I thought we might have undergraduates here. This is always very useful. See what happens when you go out carousing? Your head aches and you don't feel like eating. A drinking man is good for nothing. That has become a proverb. Have some pickle juice with honey. Or even better, take the hair of the dog with a half a glass of homemade liqueur. Here Pushkin paints a love of Kvas in a positive light, though Savelich knows some hangover remedies as well. Not vodka, but nastoyka, another homemade Russian beverage. So, honest country folk. Nobility, but Russian nobility, and therefore quite tied to the habits of the Russian peasant. We see them again, or we saw them earlier, I could say, since I'm doing this in reverse chronological order, in Pushkin's 23 to 31 novel in verse, Eugene Onegin, the work I suspect at least some of you know portions by heart. The Larins are latter-day Grignofs, especially once the paterfamilias, Dmitry Larin, has re-Russified his urban bride. Pushkin's narrator describes the lifestyle on the Larin estate. Serf-owning landowners, they maintain country ways. In chapter 2, Kvas features prominently. So let's listen to the description of the holiday and other folk habits of this noble family. Они хранили в жизни мирной привычки милой старины. У них на масленице жирной водились русские блины. 2 раза в год они говели, любили круглые качели, подблюдные песни, хоровод, День Троицы, когда народ, зевая, слушает молебен, умильно на пучок зари, они роняли слезки 3. Им квас, как воздух, был потребен. И за столом у них гостям носили блюда по чинам. So here we have the rank consciousness of, mostly lacking in Derzhavin's descriptions of hospitality and entertainment, but also the Russian habits, Orthodox rites and rituals, and folk rituals, such as fortune-telling and traditional songs and dances. The foods mentioned, blины and kvass. The easy equation of in Pushkin's stanza of folk traditions, religious rites, so-called ancient customs with the feasting and fasting of the Orthodox calendar, including the culinary habits of eating pancakes on Shrovetide and drinking kvass, serves as a kind of omnibus of Russianness, emphasized in the translation, I would say, by the doubling of the modifier, Russian pancakes, Russian cheer. It's not how it is in the original, but it works quite well in Phelan's translation. Pushkin's novel, A Portrait of Russian Life, tried to balance country ideals and life in the capital, but no one would argue that the mature Tatyana Larina of the novel's chapter 8 was happier as a society hostess than she had been as a country maiden. Her eventual husband, the Tolstoy general, had earned his stripes in the war with Napoleon, and she, the most Russian of all Russian women, was his prize. In Eugene Onegin, as in The Captain's Daughter, nothing good came of French education, nor indeed of English novel reading. Russian foods and Russian landscapes, especially in the wake of the Patriotic War, were simply better than foreign foods. So, is this nationalism? Maybe. Is it patriotism? Probably. Is it Kvas patriotism? Probably not. But I hope that I have shown, even in this truncated view, what I set out to show, that Russian ideas about food and drink become heightened during times of war and conflict, that specific Russian food items gain importance as symbols of national pride, and that these food items, such as potatoes, kvass, and shi, point back to Russia's identity as a peasant nation. Not long ago, I read a Facebook post from a colleague, originally from Russia. She was crowing about smuggling some Antonovka apples when she flew home to Canada from Lithuania. Now, it's apple season in Ohio and in New York, and I imagine in Canada as well. We have many, many different types of apples in our part of the world, most of which are quite delicious. Tart, crisp, or sweet, you can find anything your taste buds desire, right? So why import your Antonovki? There's an apple scene in the first part of I Am 20. We were looking, all of those scenes that we looked at so far have been in the second half. And this apple scene, I would say, almost rhymes with the potato scene. It also shows us the paths of our three heroes, Slava, the young husband and father, Kolya, the rake, and Sergei, the pensive one. So let's see if we can find it. I think I don't have it exactly where I want it, but maybe it'll come. Let's see. Nope, so might come back to this page 43. The tramp, so we have this scene, they're kind of in the city. Sergei is headed back, and here we go. This is Kolya.
Не стоит. Сейчас! А это билет нам не сидели?
Нет, надо новый взять.
Ну и порядки, здесь придется этим заняться.
Ну, действительно.
This is a particularly fabulous young woman.
Пробьем переулок, следующая остановка школа.
So interesting that spreading of the apples, not anymore on the floor while people are dancing, but actually on the street, doesn't invoke any kind of panic in them. Maybe it's sort of just setting us up for the later scene. It's not clear entirely what kind of apples they are that fall to the ground here. They may very well be the Russian favorites, Antonovka apples. I think that these apples play an important evocative role in Vyazemsky's film. The scene with the fare collector is repeated several times throughout the film until the very end. Let me see if I can go back to where we had her. Again, here, where was she? Here. When he gets on later, again.
Здрасте. Вы что, со всеми пассажирами здороваетесь?
Забыли, вы же мне яблоко подарили.
Здравствуйте. Весь запас вышел. Теперь до следующего сезона.
Ничего, подожду. С Новым годом вас.
Новым годом. Ну чего бы вам пожелать в Новом году?
Не знаю. А вам что?
А мне здоровья и, конечно, успехов в работе и в личной жизни.
Желаю вам всего хорошего. Следующий стадион.
All right, so she comes back, and actually it's really very sad. At the very end of the film, one of the boys gets onto the tram, and she's no longer there. Now there's a fare box. So nothing lasts forever, but we can certainly say that this human contact made through the sharing of the apple does create that lasting impression that goes throughout the film. Russians love Antonovky. The Facebook comments on my colleague's post were amusing. From personal stories of customs problems to praise for her bravery in striding confidently past the customs agents after having lied on her form with, as she put it, a bag smelling of apples pressed tightly to her chest. Discussion, as you go down, comments, Antonovky don't grow in Canada. I brought Antonovky trees to plant, but they died. I found and purchased Antonovky in Canada, but they were ridiculously expensive. Oh, it's not the right climate in Canada, and so on and so on. So there's kind of this long discussion. Clearly many of her friends are also missing their Antonovky. She refers to her stash as contraband and says, I treasure every bite. So the issue of storage is key. And as I go through to flesh out some of these arguments, obviously what is Kvas, how do these various foods work? They all work because they last in the Russian climate, especially back in the day before electricity. Beloved foods in Russia tend to be those that store well, or as Alison K. Smith has shown in her research, those that can be pickled. Russian tradition has it that Antonovka apples store very well through January in the northern climes, and sometimes as late as May. Their distinctive scent is also well documented. Antonovky were first cataloged in 1848 by Nikolai Krasnoglazov in a research handbook called The Rules of Fruit Growing in Orchards, Orangeries, and Greenhouses, and so on. They're described as having a harmonious sweet and sour taste with notes of kvass, firm flesh, and a characteristically spicy Antonovsky scent. The reference work I consulted further describes these apples as easy to grow with a high yield and as particularly hardy. The trees can withstand up to 40 degrees of frost. We're in Celsius here. The more northern the trees are, the tastier, better for health, and of course more aromatic the fruit, and the longer they last. There's all this sort of interesting stuff. You can see that they grow them further south, but then they spoil more quickly, and so on. And in Russian homes, even estate homes, sometimes you would save your Antonovky, you'd layer them in straw, and the whole estate house would begin to smell through the winter of these Antonovky apples. So, I would say that we can perceive the Antonovka apple as yet another example of all the best parts of Russia. Many Russian cookbooks with apple recipes, from pies to stuffed duck, from jams to homemade liqueurs, clarify. Whenever they have apples in the ingredient list, it will say it's best to take Antonovky. So, Kvas patriotism may have a negative connotation. False patriotism, the ostentatious touting of our own at specific political moments. But the Antonovka apple, like kvass and potatoes, like shida kasha, has a historical resonance that signifies Russianness, even for those who no longer live in Russia. In her exploration of nostalgia, Svetlana Boym talked about a specific gastronomic and auditory nostalgia. And we find proof of these aspects in Ivan Bunin's 1900 story, Antonovka Apples, where in describing the apple, the narrator highlights its characteristic scent, quote, the scent of honey and autumnal freshness, запах меда и осенней свежести, as well as the evocative sound of biting into the apple, a juicy, crunching sound, sochный треск. Like shida kasha, these apples also feature in a folk proverb. A juicy Antonovka promises a joyful year. Thank you. More than happy to discuss and answer questions and play around with some of this stuff. I would love to hear your ideas as I flesh out some of these arguments. Yeah.
So Vyazemsky is the first instance of this expression. He literally made it up.
He literally made it up. And he literally, I mean, it's actually, I mean, it makes sense, right? And I love the fact, you know, when we think about translation, that when you don't translate directly, right? I mean, that would be easy to translate directly. Some kind of, you know, lakeyski, patriotism or something, but he doesn't. And so that's the first instance of it. And then, so, you know, eventually I plan to trace the whole thing and see exactly where it shows up. I thought it was interesting to see, you know, I think that this relationship is important, that, you know, there are lots of texts and lots of authors, ranging obviously from poetry to encyclopedias, talking about the importance of local produce. It's funny to think about, you know, we all talk now about shopping locally. What is shopping locally really in farm to table then? What is it other than protectionism in a way, right? Isolationism. But we see that throughout, and it makes a lot of sense as you look through Russian history, that there are lots and lots of times, you know, where you can't get those, what was it, 30,000, what did Gogol say? All those kettles of soup that were going to be coming from Paris, right?
The melon that costs 700 rubles.
Exactly,
yeah.
but especially the soup that's good. The couriers, 30,000 couriers are going to bring you soup straight from Paris.
Right.
So those kinds of distances, right? It doesn't really work. So the more you look at the foods in, especially this 19th century literature, like Bunin's estate, any of that stuff about the countryside, you see that people are doing what they do now. They are, you know, buying cheap, selling dear. If you look, one of the things that I do in my classes, we compare the Domostroy with Molokhovets, and we look at some of the advice for what you do in order to maintain your present household. You've got 200 people potentially living in your household in the middle of nowhere. You screw up with preserving your apples, and people are starving, right? Because there's no way to get any food. So it's all this wonderful advice in the Domostroy about, you know, buy cheap, buy in quantity, go in with your neighbors. You know, some of the stuff that we're now doing here and in Russia as well. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned this at the end that you were trying to kind of figure out where these lines are between patriotism and nationalism, and I was wondering if, especially in the earlier descriptions, I mean, how much of Russia as an empire is part of what it means to have Russian cuisine, because one of the quotes that you mentioned had like Crimea. Right, and the things that are provided from there, which is kind of considered this, you know, garden of the empire as something that is part of, but also still kind of exotic in terms of the type of produce that you would get there. And I was just thinking, I know there's a farm-to-table restaurant in Moscow where they, you know, are very adamant about all the food being Russian, from Russia, and the wines are from Crimea.
Right, which is, they would say Russia.
Right, but it's this kind of idea of something being local, but it's also a very vast conception of what local is, and one that clearly deals with lots of different languages, ethnicities, you know.
Right. So, you know, I always say to my students when we're starting to dive into this stuff, I say, so you do know what the national food of England is, don't you? It's chicken masala. That's what wins. That's what people consider to be their national food. So one of the reasons why you expand your empire is to get closer to places where you can actually grow things. So that was definitely always part of the imperial expansion. And though those lands, I mean, we think of those places as not Russian, but, you know, they were being given, those lands were being given by Catherine to her courtiers who were going down there and, you know, producing things, having these vast estates. I mean, one of the things that was so fun about working on Turgot, and I've been working on him for many years now, is these descriptions of his estate. The Zvanka, which no longer exists, unfortunately, nothing survived. But they had, you know, they were growing linen, and they had their textile factories. They made everything themselves. They had, even in his estate house in St. Petersburg, they had various, you know, squat and other kinds of, you know, animals, and they did everything themselves. So thinking about, you know, distance, I mean, I do think that it would be pretty cool to explore all the different farm-to-table outfits that are happening in Moscow and other places, because I bet some of them follow the more British model of, you know, this apple traveled 6 kilometers, and some of them don't. And that would also be really interesting. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to. Well, I also think it's interesting that these, you know, tropes of localness and patriotism in food occur in all different traditions. Like, I know that, you know, in England, at the same time that Robin's writing, Pope was writing these and calling it English country houses, and how, you know, you eat English food and you don't